Hi, I'm Rob Harvilla of 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, and I am this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Mr. May, I have two questions for you, if I may. And hello, everyone. Welcome to MetaPod.
You may, Wendy. And yes, greetings, dear listeners.
What is your favorite song from the 1990s? And what song do you think explains the 90s?
Okay, so the first one is easy. It's Depeche Mode's Halo. And for fear of doing a little bit of self-promotion there, actually more on that in episodes to come, folks, I promise.
Kev, that's quite a cliffhanger.
Yes.
Oh, it is.
Well, in true storytelling fashion, cliffhangers are good. But anyway, maybe we'll come back to it later. But, okay, so the second part to your question is a bit harder. I think, actually, much to my dismay, I'd probably say something like Oasis's Wonderwall, or Wannabe by the Spice Girls, or perhaps Genie in a Bottle by Christine Aguilera.
Okay. Good choices.
Oh, yes, thank you. And the rules dictate, obviously, that now you must answer your own question, Wendy, please.
Oh, okay. This is tough. For favorite song of the 90s, I'm gonna say Cannonball by the Breeders.
It's a very good choice.
If you would be so kind as to give me a second one, it's actually a 90s remake of a 70s song. That would be Roberta Flack's Killing Me Softly, as done by the Fugees.
Mm-hmm.
And a song that explains the 90s, two, I'd say Smells Like Teen Spirit, Nirvana, and Baby Got Back by Sir Mix-a-Lot. Also said with much dismay.
Indeed, I don't actually know what song you're talking about.
Look it up.
With reference to Baby Got Back, I've heard of Smells Like Teen Spirit once or twice. So, okay, so the reason why we're quizzing each other here about songs that explain the 1990s is because our guest this week has actually done this 60 times. Yep, 60 songs that explain the 90s is a very literal title for Rob Harvilla's hard work.
Yes, and this is no ordinary podcast. Rob crafts a clever combination of facts, opinions, and interviews, wrapping it all together with a fast and funny narration of each song.
We'll put links in the show notes to our favourite episodes from his 60 shows. But for me, actually, certainly his analyses of Oasis's Wonderwall again and Madonna's Hanky Panky are brilliantly and hilariously done.
I didn't realize we were so funny, Kev, but Rob laughs a lot in our interview as we meander through his reasons for picking songs and a whole lot more. So coming up is our chat with Rob Harvilla, recorded in January.
Okay, I will start the tape.
Rob Harvilla of 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, welcome to MetaPod. Kev and I are really glad that you could join us all the way from Ohio.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Rob, tell us, why exactly do the 90s need to be explained, and who the heck needs to be explained to?
Well, when I started the show, I had the idea that my audience theoretically would be half people like me who grew up in the 90s, went to high school and college in the 90s, who would use a show like this primarily as a nostalgic project. But the other half of the audience would be young people to whom I would explain, the most important songs, events of the decade. And based on anecdotally, just the DMs I get, the emails, the feedback that I'm receiving, I think nostalgia is more like 80, 90, 95, 99.5% of the appeal for the people who are listening. And that's totally cool. But yeah, it's the 90s. What I've always said is that the 90s feel far enough away that they're safely the past, that there's something you can feel nostalgic about. But they feel it happened recently enough that it still feels like it's having an active effect on what's happening now and what's happening musically, what's happening politically, what's happening emotionally. It's a nice mix of far away but not too far away.
And do you think you will have accurately explained the 90s in full by the 60th song?
Yeah, wow. As I speak to you, I believe I am on episode 56.
Okay.
I have 4 episodes left in which to explain the 90s. I can't look you in the eye over Zoom and tell you that I think that I am 4 songs away from explaining the 90s. I am feeling quite a bit more anxious, exponentially so the closer we get to 60. I think I'm doing okay, depending on how one defines explained, fully explained. It's a good effort at the least. If that's all it ends up being, then I'm comfortable with that. I'm doing the best I can.
Can I ask you, Rob, just to butt in for a moment, why are you anxious about coming towards the end of your 60?
Because I think that when you start out, you think you have all the time in the world, all the slots in the world, but the closer we've gotten, the list of songs that we still haven't done that seem very obvious to do in a project like this, that's a very daunting list at that point. That list is longer than 4 songs, put it that way. The realization that this ends with a lot of people mad at me because I forgot XYZ and another 50 songs on top of that. That's a real concern. I'm going to have to be hiding out here. I'm going to have to hide in a more remote part of Ohio for a spell, for a few months. It's very stressful.
I don't know.
Honestly.
This has bonus content written all over it, Rob.
That's true. It does occur to me that 60 was an arbitrary number. So I started the show. I've never done anything like this before. I've never had a podcast, never done anything of this sort. And there's a certain logic to 90 songs that explain the 90s, for example. But when I was starting this show, it's like, I don't want to be the guy with a show with 90 in the title where everybody hates the show and I get canceled after 4 episodes. That would just be embarrassing. And but 60 is still a lot of songs, but 30 felt like too few, right? 60 is a very arbitrary number. I enjoy saying 60 songs, but there's no real, logic behind it. It's totally arbitrary, but that's what we're stuck with, and here at number 56, I'm just going to have to live with it, I guess.
Sorry, just as a follow-up then, by the time this episode comes out, we're recording this on the 10th of January. So by the time our episode comes out, I estimate if you're doing these once a week, how do you feel about completing the podcast?
Oh, I feel an enormous sense of relief and accomplishment having already done that. I'm thrilled. I feel very relaxed. Yeah, it's going to be tough. I feel like just for my personal enjoyment, I've gotten into a really good rhythm, the weekly rhythm and sort of the feedback loop. It's not like it being lavished, showered with DMs, messages, but just hearing from a few people every week, just feeling like people are responding in some way. I've been a working journalist for 20 plus years, and there are times when I'm getting a lot of feedback, when I write about The Weeknd, write about Kanye West, write about, music that's coming out now, but this is a more consistent amount of feedback. I feel like more people are responding to this than they've typically responded to my writing. And I've really, really enjoyed that. And so I'm very sad to lose it as well. And I'm hoping to find, some other project with which to fill, the hole that is now formed inside me.
So, Rob, just to let the audience know a little bit about you, I've noticed that your Twitter profile features Yosemite Sam. It also notes that you're an uncompensated Dairy Queen spokesman, potentially something you could explore after the podcast.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and those things.
Yosemite Sam and Dairy Queen are both very important to me, as it turns out. Was that my original? I do believe that I chose Yosemite Sam when I joined Twitter, which was 2008, maybe. And it's an arbitrary decision, but I didn't want to be one of these people who's changing their avatar constantly and confusing everybody. And so I was a big Looney Tunes kid growing up, Saturday morning cartoons. I watch them sometimes with my kid. Yosemite Sam was an arbitrary choice. once again, that I'm now stuck with, but I'm cool with that. So yeah, and I eat a lot of Dairy Queen, or I try not to eat a lot of Dairy Queen, and I tweeted so much about Dairy Queen just subconsciously that I then became very conscious of it, and so I realized it was a huge part of my brand all of a sudden, is just tweeting about, whatever the blizzard of the month was or whatever. I was very embarrassed, but then I decided to just own it. So, those are the two pillars of my being at this point.
Okay, so for listeners who don't know what the Dairy Queen blizzard is, maybe you could just tell us your favorite one and what the ingredients are of it.
Yes.
I swear we'll get to the music.
No, that's fine. I'll talk.
It's worth noting. It's worth noting, Rob, that I asked Wendy the exact same question just 3 days ago, because I didn't know what a blizzard was. So, but for our esteemed listeners, go for it.
A blizzard is ice cream. Dairy Queen ice cream is soft serve mixed with candy, with various kinds of candy. So you can get like Butterfinger, Heath, M&Ms, etc. Which one are you reacting to, Wendy? What is your personal favorite?
Anything with peanut butter.
I was gonna say peanut butter is my personal favorite. Like they got one. It's like literally, it's called like the extreme Reese's. The word extreme is in the title of this dessert. That's the level I'm operating on now. The extreme peanut butter blizzard, which I believe involves both Reese's peanut butter cups and Reese's Pieces. That is probably my personal favorite. This will eventually ruin my life if it hasn't already. But it's been a popular Dairy Queen product for at least 20, 30 years at this point.
Right. And you're based in Ohio, which I guess is safe to say is the center of the rock and roll universe, since the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is based there.
That's actually, yes.
I thought that would be the right thing to say.
Yes.
What's unique about Ohio? And assuming that you grew up there, is there something unique about the music growing up there?
Okay, I was born in Cleveland. I grew up, I was in St. Louis, Missouri as a little kid, but I grew up mostly in the suburbs of Cleveland. I went to Ohio University to study journalism. First job was here in Columbus, Ohio. I met my wife. We moved to Oakland, California. We moved to New York City for a while. We came back here to Columbus to raise kids. We will remain here probably for the rest of our lives. We got our family around. We're dinging it. There are 3 Dairy Queen locations within 10 minutes of my house. Everything's great. Yes, it is very true that Cleveland is the birthplace of rock and roll. According to Cleveland, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum is an excellent place to spend an afternoon, at least 90 minutes. Is there a musical quality? Obviously, what I've always loved about Columbus, my first job was here in Columbus, Ohio, working for an alt weekly. I started in 2000. I was here for 3 or 4 years. And I grew up on alternative rock radio, which was a very big thing in the Midwest, I gather, especially. That's sort of the bedrock, my foundation. I'm near Ohio State University. There's a lot of really good local music here. There's a really good indie radio station called CD10. I don't know what frequency it is. They keep changing. It was CD101 when I got here. So I guess I would say, at least for me growing up in the mid 90s, Midwestern alt rock radio, which always felt like it had a very specific flavor to me, is sort of how I got to be the way that I am.
Okay.
Okay, let's find out more about the way you are then, Rob, if we can. I mean, and for those that are listening now, if you hear a pause, that's because Rob's cat's been crawling all over him. So
she's taken now to like biting cords. She keeps biting, iPhone chargers in half. It's like this is disconcerting habit we're getting into. She's
okay.
Fine.
Well, you've banished her for a little while anyway. Okay, so from your also esteemed list then for the podcast, and we can assume that you've published all 60 now. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the quintessential 1990s track from your list?
Ooh, okay, the quintessential, if there was just one. Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind, which is a song. I didn't even go into this project thinking I definitely have to do that song. That wasn't on the absolute, I'm going to get shot if I don't do this list. necessarily. I sort of chose it arbitrarily one day. I put it together very quickly, but I did find that one to be particularly enjoyable. I get a bit more feedback about it than I thought I would, proportional to like what you would think of as bigger songs, bigger artists, more canonical. And so I think for my purpose, again, which is mixing, a critical perspective from a very personal perspective, I think if you have to choose one song, it has to be something that's not like a totally, totally, totally obvious thing. It's not necessarily Tupac or Nirvana or whatever. It's something like one level down in terms of critical importance, but that has a great deal of personal importance for people. It's a song that was ubiquitous. And even if they didn't love it, even if they didn't seek it out, they know it so intimately just because of how popular it was that they love it, even if they hate it, if that makes sense. And it feels like Semi-Charmed Life, for some reason, sits at that exact nexus of like a really big hit that's ubiquitous, but is not held up as like, one of the top 5-10 canonical tracks of the 90s, but it's something that everybody knows. And most importantly, everyone has an opinion on. You're not an agnostic about Third Eye Blind, about Third Eye Blind's frontman, about Semi-Charmed Life. Like you have some sort of life experience loving or hating this song just because you've spent so much time with this song, whether you wanted to or not.
That's fair enough then. So how, alongside that one, what kind of criteria, other than some of the ones you've kind of hinted at already then, Rob, did you go through to pick the other 59?
I think that, you start out a list like this, a long list, and you have to pick out the songs that are very, very obvious, right? Like there's absolutely no way you could do a good faith assessment of the 90s. Not talk about Lauryn Hill, for example. However, there's a list of 10 to 15 obvious ones to start. And then there is sort of a mid-range list of like massive hits that all feel obvious when you ruminate on them just for 10 seconds, but aren't the most canonical, aren't the Smells Like Teen Spirit type songs. And it proceeds like that in tiers. But I also wanted to set a few aside that were just for me, that just had a very personal meaning for me, or I felt like I could bring something special, something unexpected to them, like sort of wild cards, I guess is the easiest way to put it. And so it's always been, working with my editor, Justin Sales, this whole time, like just having these terrible tyrannical Google Docs, like full of songs. And like suddenly you wake up one day, it's like, Tori Amos, how can I not do Tori Amos? And then I do it and I love it. Like the other thing that I want to allow myself is a little bit of space. Like I have never known for sure what the next 3 to 5 episodes are going to be even. Like I want to make sure that I can wake up one day and decide I want to listen to Tori Amos all week. I haven't done this for years. I just want to do it. Like I can make a snap decision like that. So it's this really weird balance between the obvious and the unexpected, and like the well-planned versus the flexible, and we just sort of stumbled along, and gotten, as I speak to you, to 56, and if I'm not dead by the time your listeners hear this, then I succeeded somehow.
Do listeners agree with your take on the songs as you present them? And what's the most surprising feedback you've received from a listener?
Okay. I didn't come into this expecting to be this way, but I have found myself just naturally like not ever being like, I hate this song. I totally hate this song. If you like this song, I hate you. You know what I'm saying? Like everybody has songs that they actively dislike, and that's as much a part of their character as like songs that they love. Mm-hmm. But I decided gradually over the course of this, I came into this not wanting to yuck other people's yum, for lack of any other way of saying it. Like there's not a lot of negativity. The one exception to this, I wanted one episode where my guest, like every episode obviously is me talking about it for a long time, and then I interview, somebody else about it and get their perspective. I wanted one episode where the guest hated the song.
Okay. Because
I just thought that would be funny. And I arbitrarily, I spent a long time trying to find the right person and the right song. And I arbitrarily, well, not arbitrarily, this dude Jay Caspian Kang, this wonderful sports and political writer. He's got a podcast now. He put out a book this year, but he every so often he would tweet about how much he hated Night Swimming by REM, which is a song that I love, which is a band that I love, but he had this very specific visceral dislike of Night Swimming by REM. And it's like, that's what I want. I want to talk to that guy. And so I did an episode, and I did, because I was talking to somebody who hated the song, my part of the episode is like this especially florid, like personal sentimental journey through my love of REM, like as a kid and as a high schooler and as a collegiate, doofus. And it's like, now I'm going to bring in this guy and he's going to tell you why anyone who loves this song is an asshole and you should never talk to them again. And like, people are still mad at me for talking to a guy, for like ruining, my florid exploration of why Night Swimming is a wonderful song with this guy who's just like, yeah, it's awful. He did exactly what I wanted him to do. He made a very compelling argument. I'm very grateful to him, but I'm glad that I did that once. And I think I'm only going to do that once. Have somebody like just come on specifically to say, yo, this song is terrible.
Have you ever tried to get any of the artists on the show themselves, or is that just opening yourself up to something that you don't want to get into?
We did consider, and we have had a few times, Open Mike Eagle, the rapper, did the episode about the Breeders, about Last Splash. We have had a few musicians, the dude from Eve 6, Max from Eve 6 did Third Eye Blind, in fact. I listen to a ton of podcasts. I read a ton of interviews. I feel like I read and hear a lot of artists describing their own work. Right. I felt sort of instinctively like this wasn't a place where like I want to try and get like, this is never going to happen. But like Courtney Love to come on and talk about like why Hole is great. Right. Like I'd rather talk to somebody else, somebody more impartial, even if only slightly more impartial. It just you get a lot of artists touting their own work elsewhere. And this felt like a place, if we were going to bring in popular sort of known musicians, I wanted it to be them describing their own favorite songs, something that they have no professional affiliation with, which is something that was important to them growing up. That felt like a better way to go about it.
I think it's, and you'll forgive me if you disagree, hopefully, but I think it would be fair to say that it's fairly unconventional in the way it's produced, narrated. It starts off without a theme tune. It's just you starting to talk. At the beginning of the Oasis Wonderwall one, I think within the first 20 seconds, you're asking your mum to turn it off because there's going to be lots of bad language. I think. How did you come up with that style? And I wonder whether your answer mirrors what I think.
Well, I definitely want to know what you think, first of all. It developed naturally, I think. I have guested. The Ringer does a ton of podcasts, people who do this professionally and have for 5 to 10, 15 years now. I've guested on those, but I've never done anything like this before. And so I was just starting from scratch. I had an idea of what I wanted, but I'm a writer. So I just started out writing it and then speaking it out loud, right? Like I am never in a million years going to go back and listen to say like the first 5 episodes that I did chronologically. I started with You Ought to Know by Alanis Morissette. What I will say is that episode is about 25% as long as the average episode now. Like I now talk like 4 times as much. That's the first thing that developed naturally. Like that's disconcerting. But yeah, I realized academically that I couldn't just type out a normal essay and speak it. Like I had to actually learn to perform it and sort of adapt it to this format. But I did that, hopefully not arduously, but over the course of these 56 episodes that I've done. And one thing that happened is they got way longer. But hopefully another thing that happened is that I found a way to not ever go too far into performing them. I don't want to come on like I'm any kind of thespian, like I'm doing a one-man play or anything, but naturally, it just sort of developed this style that it made my writing better. I really do think that, because what I've always disliked about my writing, for the Ringer, for anywhere, is that it gets a little convoluted, right? The sentences get a little long. There's like 5 semicolons and 6 adverbs. It's just disconcerting. Like one thing that I learned immediately is that if I'm going to be talking out loud, like it lends itself to shorter sentences and just simpler clearer thoughts. And I think that has helped, the writing that I've done that doesn't have anything to do with the show, but I think it developed for me a style of writing for this show that feels natural, that feels like a performance, and it feels like I'm just talking to you. But I know it also feels totally like written and totally, hopefully, organized. It's a weird balance, but I like where I've ended up.
Okay, yeah, that was. I said to Wendy last week, we've been swapping our feedback on various episodes and one-liners from lots of episodes, actually, because some of it really is very funny. And I think I said to Wendy, and I'm paraphrasing my own comment here, about, it reads like a feature article in the New Yorker or the Observer where I am, and you've spoken it out. And that's not a criticism. Yeah. That's, it's that kind of relaxed Sunday, sit back and listen, where ordinarily you would read it. Does that make sense?
That's great to hear. That's rad to hear. I don't even know if I aspired, to that level, but that's wonderful to hear. That's awesome.
Okay. And just last one from me for a moment. Does your mum listen to the podcast?
It's been a while. If she listened to that Oasis episode where I told her to turn it off, she hasn't mentioned it, which I don't put past her, but I am trying to think of the last one that she listened to, and it has been a really, really long time. If she is still listening, if she is a fan of this show at all, that she's keeping it really close to the vest. She's being real cagey about it. I don't think she's listening anymore. It's fine. She's very busy. I take no offense.
So when Kevin said that he thought you were a feature writer, I imagined that you would be a drive time satellite radio DJ that my dad would really enjoy in the car.
Okay.
Also a compliment.
That's nice too. Yes. I thank you. That's if your dad's into it, then I'm into it.
I mean, how did you want people that were listening to react to the show? Did you imagine they would just be laughing or learning about new songs that they hadn't heard or arguing with you?
I sort of shied away from the argument part of it. I think the show is overall pretty positive. That felt like a natural impulse. Again, I sort of started with the idea that half my audience would be people who didn't know the artist, and I would be explaining more, and half of it would be, sort of joining me on this nostalgia trip. I think the nostalgia trip is way higher of a percentage of this enterprise, and that's cool. And so I think I naturally gravitate toward humor, something lighthearted, but I wouldn't go so far as to say like I want them, I'm trying to teach them things, but there have been a handful of episodes that have been a little weightier, right? Sinead O'Connor, Aaliyah, I dreaded for a very, very long time. I sort of weighed whether to get in, can I do this without addressing R. Kelly at all? How do I do Sinead O'Connor when, she's had such a rough life, but also she had a very rough series of interactions with Prince. Like, can I do this episode and avoid that? Like, I can't. Like, I try and avoid those episodes. Fiona Apple, another one. I try to avoid like taking sitcoms used to have like a very special episode, right? When they address like this very serious thing and the entire tone changes. I didn't want it to be that stark, but there are occasions when there's just what I'm talking about is more serious and there's a tragic element. There's just a very severe, aspect of it that I have to be very careful and very sensitive about. And so again, it's finding that balance. There are episodes, there are songs where I'm just able to sort of screw around. Achy Breaky Heart springs to mind for some reason, where it's just me sort of nerding out about Weird Al Yankovic at length for some reason. But I did want to balance that with some that were heavier and more serious, and try and bring as light a touch as I can to those while still doing those topics and those people justice.
So, I mean, in terms of the 90s as a decade and the culture of that decade and music, do you feel that there were more controversial events of the decade than other decades, or not so much? How would you characterize the decade?
Let's see. One artist that I've also been dreading for a long time is Britney Spears, right? And Baby One More Time comes at the end of the decade. It's a huge hit. You know, if you're going to do a project like this that explains the 90s, it's hard to avoid her. But even the last 6 months, you know, to a year of Britney Spears discourse, it's been wild to watch this unfold. And part of what's happened just very recently for us is people going back and seeing how she was covered in the 90s, just those magazine covers, just the way the paparazzi treated her, like this habit now. And people have written really excellent pieces about it. Lindsay Zolads wrote about this for the New York Times, about these documentaries now that go back and look at something that happened in the 90s and talk about how the media reaction to it was often so screwed up. Woodstock 99, Fiona Apple and Tori Amos, like talking about their experiences with sexual assault and just the very insensitive way that some people, some critics, some interviewers handled that topic, you know, in the late 90s versus how they would be expected to handle it now. Yeah. I think what typifies this decade and what I often, you know, the way R. Kelly was talked about even 2 years ago, you know, prior really to surviving R. Kelly, you know, some people had been writing the truth about R. Kelly and trying to alert everybody else to the truth about him for years and years, decades, you know, but even in the 90s, he was still just an R&B god, you know, with some controversial aspects to his personal life. I think the weirdest thing for me going back is those situations. When I go back and I read Rolling Stone and Spin, even the New York Times, you know, when I see how some of these artists were covered, even positively covered back then, it's just stuff that would never ever fly now. And you sort of realize that it changed our whole perception of them, the way that people wrote about them, you know, things that they would never be able to say now without, you know, getting flamed on Twitter at least.
I think one other thing that happened, well, that started in the mid to late 80s, was the whole campaign for parental warnings on music led by Tipper Gore. And it's odd how that's pretty much obsolete now, or it doesn't really, sort of pointless with the way that music is consumed now. I mean, how did explicit music lyrics inform your teenage music years? Did those labels make a difference?
I mean, it made that music cooler.
Right.
You know, I remember I was raised Catholic, at least for a little while, and I had, you know, these religious classes, these confirmation classes. And I remember being in one and everybody being a buzz about 2 Live Crew, right? Like Me So Horny was a big deal, like banned in the USA, like that whole controversy was happening. And that just made everybody want to go out and find a way to listen to 2 Live Crew. Same with the Ghetto Boys. You know, I'm working on it this week. It will be out in the world by the time this airs. Like, I'm doing Rage Against the Machine this week, but I'm also talking about Ice-T's Cop Killer, Body Count, you know, which is sort of the quintessential, like that album, that song is not on streaming, you know, which does not feel like an accident to me. There are still holes that sort of happen organically, but I remember that song, you know, I didn't grow up in a super strict, you know, religious house, but like my parents were paying attention to what I was listening to. You know, they would wince when I would get around to wanting like Guns N' Roses, things like that. Like those labels did matter, and those labels did affect what I was able to hear or how old I was when I heard it. And you're right that it's not as big a deal now. And I think part of that is down to like my parents could keep me, you know, from the Body Count record, you know, in 1992 to a far more effective degree than like I could keep my children away from music I didn't want them to hear now. Like I unless I, you know, periodically we tell my boys that YouTube, you know, went out of business and doesn't exist anymore and they can't go to it ever again, and they like believe me for 30 seconds or whatever, but like I don't know what I'm going to do when they're teenagers. And it's like, short of cutting off the Wi-Fi in this house, I cannot keep them with 100% accuracy from the music I don't want them to hear. Part of it is just simple access in that way.
If you want to see, I have 2 teenage children. If you want to see a natural disaster born from within inside a household, turn the Wi-Fi off and see what. Honestly.
Okay. So that will cause more problems than it solves. That's good to know. That's not good to know, but I'm glad I know.
Yeah, it's just worth knowing. It's kind of fun to do every now and again to see to see the reaction you get. And I'm making an assumption that perhaps you see the 90s as a golden age of music. If yes, explain why. And if not, which decade was the golden age of music, if we're allowed to use that cliche?
I think that 95% of the time somebody refers to any age of music as the golden age, it's when they were a teenager. Right. It's the fact of the matter is that in the 90s, I went to high school and college, and that's the end of the ball game as far as I'm concerned. I fancy myself like an active listener. I love music. I listen to as much new music as I can, both for personal and professional reasons, but there's no way I will ever have as personal, as intense a relationship with as much music as I did when I was a teenager in the 90s. And so that makes this by default the golden age for me, and like parts of the 80s as well, because I was a kid, I was just jabbing MTV directly into my veins, starting from when I was 5, 6, 7 years old. And so I do think, there are actual canonical agreed upon golden ages, including for hip hop. And I think that there's an argument for that here in the 90s. There's a very specific flavor that 90s hip hop had. And it's also the continued commercial ascent of it. Like those two things working in tandem, the quality and the increased quantity and visibility of it. Like there's a legitimate argument for like an objective golden age of hip hop in that sense. But again, I think it's all down to when you were young, and you can retain a lot of that zeal all your life. It does get a little harder as you grow up and you've got kids of your own, and you got responsibilities, and the music is not being marketed to you anymore. Like I'm writing about Billie Eilish, I'm writing about Olivia Rodrigo, and I can bring a lot of scholarship to bear on those records, but I'm just not going to experience them the way a teenager experiences them. They're not for me the way it's for them. And so that's what I've always thought of as a golden age, is what's personal to you and what you listened to and loved when you were growing up.
What was the first gig you saw, Rob?
The answer to that is the Monkees, with Weird Al Yankovic opening at the Muni in St. Louis, Missouri. I believe it was when the Monkees were on MTV, right? There was a period where they were in reruns on MTV and they had sort of a second life to them. It was Dare to Be Stupid era Weird Al Yankovic. We had to leave. It was past my bedtime or whatever. We left before the Monkees played Last Train to Clarksville. I was really depressed, but it was a great show. That was the first show. I also think I have like a weird sense memory of seeing the Doobie Brothers at Six Flags when I was like a super little kid, like up in the bleachers. I may have just implanted that myself somehow, but I'm pretty sure that happened and it may have been earlier. But the Monkees and the Weird Al, it was the first one I was truly conscious of.
I mean, some might argue that the 90s was bore the arrival of some specific genres. So, for example, shoegaze, as it was.
Right.
And kind of techno music really came to the fore at the end of the 80s into the 90s. Are there any genres that you were most happy to see the back of that kind of came and went?
Ooh, I make a lot of jokes about ska. I was in a ska band in college. We were called.
What did you play?
I played bass.
Good instrument in the ska, yeah.
I was pretty good. The group was called Scantily Plaid, SK.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And I didn't name the band. It's a fantastic name. This was right. It was 96, 97. So it was in America, like the third wave of ska, right? Like Real Big Fish, No Doubt. It was all very lame in retrospect. But again, like I've touched on that in a few episodes of the show, and I remember it fondly. Like I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I listened to ska all day long, anything like that. Same with swing. There was a year, I believe, in 1997, I saw both the Cherry Poppin' Daddies and Big Bad Voodoo Daddy live, different shows. Like that never happened again. And I don't know if I would ever want that to happen again. Like that feels like a good candidate to be like, yeah, we probably should. But even that's like, it was weird. It was bizarre. And I think you have to allow, weird, bizarre, potentially distasteful and like, I don't really want to relive this, elements into your life every now and then. And so, yeah, there are certainly genres that I was into for a cup of coffee, as a 21-year-old that I don't really return to now as a mature, 43-year-old, but I don't regret or renounce any of it per se.
I suppose related to that, if I can, many people reach a certain age and they might hear something and they roll their eyes and go, oh, the music of today, it's terrible. Do you do that yet?
No. And I again, it's harder work potentially to do that. I sort of listen to music and acknowledge like this music is trying to upset me, but I'm not going to allow it to. I am cool enough to understand why a young person would think this is cool. Like I can at least get to that level. And that's a professional qualification, of course. Like this, I consider myself a rock critic, and I try to be mindful of what my areas of expertise and my blind spots are in terms of both genre and both terms of era. My joke that I make constantly is at The Ringer, like I'm one of the only people writing at The Ringer who was alive in the 80s. At this point, it's very upsetting to me. So like when Bob Saget dies, I'm one of the very few people at the site who can really talk about what it was like when Bob Saget was just getting started in Full House, America's Funniest Home Videos in the 90s. Like I understand what my wheelhouse is, and of course this show is a representation of what I regard my wheelhouse as. But there's nothing that I listen to that's like, oh, this is absolutely terrible. Because again, I think another aspect of that golden age when you're a teenager, when you're in high school, when you're in college, is that this is music being made to and marketed to you, and it's yours. And it's yours in the sense that it's not theirs. It's not older people's. Like it's supposed to be exclusionary in that sense. My parents aren't supposed to be into the same music that I am when I'm 21, and they're not. And so I try and respect when I come across something now, something new, something made by a 17-year-old, whose like artist name is just like a random string of words. I get very confused and I have to work a lot harder to figure it out. And again, I'm always going to approach it in a more academic way than like a kid would, who just sort of understands what's happening here. But I do try and keep that curiosity open.
Personally, a few years ago, my daughter, who would have been 15 at the time, was listening to things that I would categorize as, oh, that's a load of shite.
Like
being
what?
The kind of grumpy old, a lot of UK R&B stuff, just not really into it.
Okay.
And then a year ago, she came back and she said, I really like the Arctic Monkeys. And all of a sudden, just like that overnight, I'm kind of into Ella's music. It's great. Oh, wow. So it did change on a dime. Sorry.
That's a beautiful thing. Circle of life.
With one of your episodes, you, and I think perhaps your guest, say that by the late 90s, everyone gets an alt rock hit. And I was wondering what you think everyone gets now.
Everyone gets a viral TikTok meme.
That's
as
you
close
don't know
as I
how
can
close
get.
to the truth you might be with that.
Okay, yeah, that's as close as I'm ever gonna get, I'm afraid, but I'm hoping it's pretty close. What episode was that? Do you remember?
Ooh.
Not to put you on the spot.
So this is where we just say it really quickly and edit it in like we knew straight away which episode.
I'm just wondering if it was The Breeders.
The Breeders might have been it, because Cannonball was sort of an unlikely hit. The second episode I ever did was Hey Jealousy by the Gin Blossoms. And sort of right off the bat, like that was a song when I first started thinking about this that I wasn't like, I absolutely got to do Hey Jealousy. This whole thing is bullshit if I don't do Hey Jealousy. But like once I got into it, it's like, yes, of course. And I feel like those songs tend to be alt rock hits. It's like you dig just past the first layer of any alt rock hit and you find a story worth telling, or a story that's like, how can I have a larger project like this and not tell this story? There is that quality very specific to me to alternative rock, which again is what I grew up on, as a teenager. And that probably explains why I feel that way. But it definitely does feel like even these one-hit wonders, something like Chumbawamba's Tub Thumping, It's a song, even if you haven't heard even if you haven't heard it or thought about it for 25 years, it's just there's a fascinating backstory there that's legitimately worth, digging into.
Yeah, I think that you also discussed the chaos of the decade, and that if you were listening to college radio at the time, you may have heard quite an eclectic mix of things, probably part of the episode as well.
Yeah. I did college radio in the late 90s, and I still remember when we started playing You Got Me by The Roots. And some people were like, this is not right. Like our tagline was Athens. We were in Athens, Ohio. Athens only alternative, ACRN. And they're like, this is not alternative. This is not alternative music. We were playing like Flashlight by George Clinton. Like we started having these arguments about what alternative was.
Yes.
Another thing, another specific thing about the 90s is I always wonder how true this actually is, or if it's just hindsight, but it's like you didn't seem to have people who listened to everything, right? Like it felt more siloed off. And part of the reason for that is like you had to buy the CDs. You could only listen to the music that you went out and bought. You were going to go for the things that interested you most. Like you weren't able to be as adventurous and listen to anything ever the way you obviously can now. And like that is more likely to funnel you only into alternative rock or only into hip hop or only into R&B. You just didn't have as much eclecticism in the average listener as you obviously do now. And I'm sure that in turn affected the music that was made. Like alt rock bands are playing alt rock music for only the people who really love alt rock. Whereas now I think artists start out with this idea that they can cross over to everybody, and then they do.
Just curious if there's any bands that really cross so many decades that you felt you couldn't include them in this show.
Oh,
yeah, there was some messiness there. The Cure, for example, the question, okay, so like once I realized that nostalgia, that my audience was almost exclusively people like me who grew up with this music, the idea like, well, I could do the 80s next, right? Like I could do 60 songs that explain the 80s, but like, am I aging up my target audience? Right, is the concern there. Like is now like the only people who are really going to be interested in the show are people who are, in their 50s and were teenagers in the 80s. And The Cure, like there are a couple records that just really annoy me by the fact that they came out in 1989. Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation would be one example of that. And is The Cure's Disintegration 89? I think it is.
Yes. Yeah.
But okay. And so that's another one where it's like, I could do Friday I'm in Love, and I would love to do Friday I'm in Love. Who says that I'm not going to? But what I would obviously prefer to do is, Love Song or something else off Disintegration, because that album's so important to me. But the question is like, if I do it now, can I not do it if I go back to the 80s or if I go forward to the aughts? The biggest argument against the aughts is that I hate the term the aughts. Okay. I wish there were a better way to describe, from 2000 to 2009, but that's always been a consideration, as you say. Like Madonna was sort of vexing in this way. Like I had to address Madonna, and we went with Vogue, but that was one where I had to confine it pretty specifically to what she did in the 90s, because if I started talking about her in the 80s, I was going to run out of time. If I talked about her from 2000 on, I was going to run out of time. Like I had to it's such a big catalog that I had to narrow it down to just her 90s stuff, which was plenty, obviously, but it is vexing when you have an artist who's been working for that long. Like Prince is another example. Michael Jackson is another example. These people were active. They put out great records, but not their best records in the 90s. Like, how do you account that?
Well, we've got a quick fire round for you, if that's all right.
Please. Okay.
Please. Ready? And Kevin and I will take turns firing these questions out at you.
Okay.
You ready? And it's generally the theme is the personal best and worst of the 90s.
Oh dear. Okay.
All right. I'm going to start off with personal favorite vinyl, CD, or single.
When I think about 90s CDs, I think about Pearl Jam's Vitology, which is an album that meant a lot to me. But also the CD case was larger. It was like, I don't know, it was like book size, and it was a little bit taller than the other CDs. And so it looked really pompous, even sitting on your CD shelf. Like that felt like a very deliberate choice that Eddie Vedder, et cetera, made. And so if I think about a CD from the 90s, that's the first one that jumps out to me. And like Pearl Jam was, top 3, top 2, maybe my favorite band, when I was in high school.
So you preferred the CD format?
I certainly did back then. I mean, it's embarrassing to say, like, I can burn a CD onto my computer, et cetera, but that doesn't feel like the same thing. Like, I have a stereo, I have a modest collection of vinyl, but I do not have a dedicated CD player, even though like my CD player was my most prized possession all through high school and college, right? I feel very naked without a CD player at this point, but I do not have one.
Right, Rob, let's assume that you did have lots of band posters in your bedroom when you were in the 90s and a teenager. What would have been your favourite? Or, phrased another way, which one would you have been most disappointed to lose if your cat climbed up and pulled it down?
I don't know if you're basketball people, NBA people, but I grew up in Cleveland. I was a Cleveland Cavs fan. And even so, a very strange thing is for most of high school, even though Michael Jordan was like the terror of, the scourge of the Cleveland Cavaliers in that period. And that is the only poster that I can picture on my wall back then. I had a Rolling Stone subscription and I was big into like cutting out pictures from it and putting them on my wall. But it's hard for me to remember them now. I cannot, that is a bizarre sort of block because I'm sure that I had them, but the only one I can remember is like not a life size, but like a very tall Michael Jordan poster, like looking down on me, and vanquishing my beloved Cleveland Cavs once again. It's a very disconcerting thing that I owned now that I think about it.
Your favorite music video from the era?
Oh gosh. I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is November Rain.
Ooh.
Which I don't know if I ever watched and thought, that had the concrete thought, this is my favorite episode, my favorite music video of this era. But it certainly is probably the one that I saw the most, just based on how often it was on MTV. You Could Be Mine, the Guns N' Roses again, like the Terminator 2 crossover video. Like I saw that like 50,000 times. I tend to think about Guns N' Roses if you're talking about like the most ubiquitous videos. Sweet Child of Mine, like Welcome to the Jungle sort of unnerved me, like even Patience. Like I wasn't like a hardcore Guns N' Roses person. And again, that was a band my parents were not really into exposing me to if they could help it. But those are the videos that stick out to me the most. And that obviously starts in the late 80s, but it continues at least a little bit into the 90s.
And your most despised video?
Despised. See, again, like I'm sure I did hate things, and define myself in opposition to them, like everybody does. But I don't sit here now despising anything or particularly having a memory of despising anything. There were plenty of songs, plenty of videos that like I just got tired of, like Blind Melon's No Rain. It's like the B-Girl is quite amusing, like, the first 200 times. But after a while, it's like, yeah, we got it. Like the captive elements of MTV where they just kept showing you the same thing, whether you wanted it or not, like that turns you on pretty benign bands and songs and videos. But I cannot think of anything that the word despise encapsulates.
Let's assume, if we can, Rob, that you handed over bass playing duties momentarily. So who would be in your 1990s supergroup?
Oh my goodness! This is a group that I am in, or this is a group that I am assembling?
You've decided not to play bass in this one.
No, that would be a bad idea. Okay, it's hard to have Flea in there, eh? Flea is proved himself remarkably. He mixes well. He plays well with others. Flea does, and so I guess we're gonna put him on bass. What popped into my head is Chris Cornell singing. Like Soundgarden was somebody. I would never thought of myself as a super fan, but I always really dug when I heard them on the radio. I had Super Unknown and I loved that a lot. But I think Chris Cornell has emerged, and part of that is the tragedy of his story, but like both his vocals and just his style, like just his beauty, for lack of a word, like he sort of emerged in retrospect for me as like the quintessential, alt rock frontman. in terms of the total package. And so I guess what I'm assembling is a grunge / alt rock supergroup here. Flea and Chris Cornell. You got to get Kim Deal in there as well. This is already a very strange mix of people, but whether, she can play bass, she can play guitar. She has one of my favorite voices in rock history. I think we got to get Kim Deal involved in sort of like a rotating sort of power trio, if that makes, we don't have a drummer though. I'm taking this way too seriously.
I bet she can play drums.
I bet she can play drums. Let's get the dude from Tool to play drums, right? Danny Carey. This is an incredibly loud, and even with Kim, sort of macho band. But that's what I'll go with. Those four. Let's see what they come up with.
All right, I think the last one is name your quintessential 90s album art.
Wow. Yeah, the Vitology thing springs to mind.
Okay.
But the first thing I see often when I close my eyes, when I did a Radiohead episode, I did an episode on Creep, and I talked about going to a record store and seeing like all the album covers and being sort of entranced by them. And like each of them cost $17 and like agonizing over which one to buy. And Teenage Fan Club's Bandwagon-esque. Mm-hmm. It's like, isn't it pink? And it's the bag of money.
Yeah.
And I really loved that song, the concept. When I heard it on the radio, I saw them on Saturday Night Live, and like I almost bought Bandwagon-esque like thousands of times from the record store when I was in high school, and I never did. And of course I listened to it eventually. I loved it. It was like, I really wish I'd had this record when I was a kid. And so that album cover stays with me as like the road not taken, or the I suppose the road not taken sooner. Like when I think about album art, I think about these records that I used to agonize about whether or not to buy them, and like including that album art in the decision to buy them or not, and I didn't get it right 100 or even 50% of the time. And Bandwagon-esque is one that I did regret for a while. And so that cover does stay with me for that reason.
Okay. So we look forward to hearing the final 4 episodes of 60 songs that define the 90s. We appreciate your time, and I personally want to say I still think each Liam Gallagher vowel gets its own Parker is quite possibly one of the funniest lines I've ever heard on a podcast.
That's very kind of you to say. I really appreciate you talking. I really appreciate you listening, and it means a lot, just to talk to you. So thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thanks for coming on the show. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Rob.
I get a feeling that Rob could pick many subjects and create a funny, informative, and unique collection for a podcast, Wendy.
Such as 50 films that annoy my dad.
Or 20 household chores that irritate teenagers, which actually, on reflection, there are about 50 of those, I can tell you.
And don't forget the classic 25 dressings that can ruin a salad.
Yeah, indeed. The list is endless. But sadly, our interview with Rob was not. So we had to let him go. Actually, he had to go and pick up his kids. But our huge thanks to him for speaking with us a few months ago. We wish him well with whatever comes next.
We do. In fact, let's go 90s and make it extreme well wishes with an X, okay? So talking of extreme, and not in a caffeinated Mountain Dew flavored Sour Patch Kids kind of way, we've got another music-related podcast coming up toward the end of May. That's with Robert Rodriguez, who has produced, as we look at the list now, 228 episodes of Something About the Beatles.
Yeah, there's another big clue in the title as to the subject matter. If there could be a university faculty of Beatleness and a professor of Fab Four, Rob would be there.
Indeed, it's an extraordinary podcast with what feels like unlimited angles on Liverpool's finest export.
Indeed. We've got a few more shows to come between now and then, of course, featuring the What Could Go Right, It's Nice to Hear You, and the Extortion Economy podcasts.
Yeah, so we'll be back in 2 weeks. But Kev, when are we going to hear more about that cliffhanger you mentioned earlier?
Okay, right.
Depeche
So,
Mode one.
Yes, very briefly then, for a bit of self-promotion, I have a book which comes out on the 5th of August, co-written with a very fine and one of our loyal listeners, David McElroy. It's about Depeche Mode, and more details will be on halotheviolatorbook.com in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Okay, then. Hello to David. And
hello,
stay
David.
Tuned. Thanks again to Rob Harvilla, and we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.